Welcome back to the True Detectives podcast, everybody. I'm so glad you could join us again for another week of crazy, weird, and sometimes downright unbelievable detective stories.
It's like we always say, truth is stranger than fiction. And when it comes to the world of investigations, well, sometimes the most fascinating cases are the ones that really push the boundaries of what we think we know about crime and detection.
Exactly. So buckle up because this time we're diving into two cases that are about as unusual as they come. We'll be pulling excerpts from Ghost Code and Blood Oath, and trust me, these are going to leave you thinking, wow, I did not see that coming.
What I find really compelling about these particular stories is how they challenge the very definition of a detective. We're so used to thinking about detectives in that classic hard-boiled mold,
Yeah.
trench coats, dimly lit alleys, that sort of thing.
Right. But these stories really throw those conventions out the window. We've got one detective wrestling with digital sabotage in the heart of Silicon Valley.
And then another one who's, well, let's just say he's not exactly your average gumshoe. He's a vampire detective grappling with murders within his own kind.
Yeah, talk about a unique skill set. I mean, who knew staking out could take on a whole new meaning, right?
Right, but that's what makes this so fascinating. Makes you wonder, how do the fundamental tools of investigation, those building blocks like observation, deduction, and understanding motive, how do those change when you apply them to these wildly different worlds?
Yeah.
What's the essential toolkit of an investigator when the crime scene is, well, a line of code?
Yeah.
Or the victim is, a creature of the night?
It's a really good question. So let's jump right in, shall we? Our first stop is 1990s Silicon Valley, and I'm already feeling a little nostalgic, even though I was just a kid back then. Remember dial-up modems and those giant clunky computers? But anyway, picture this. You're in the middle of this hyper-caffeinated, supercharged tech startup called NetQuest.
Yeah, I remember reading about those early days of the internet. It was the Wild West out there, a gold rush for ideas, and everybody was scrambling to stake their claim.
Exactly. And NetQuest is on the verge of striking it big.
Okay.
They're not just building another browser, they're aiming for a whole damn digital universe, as they put it. I mean, it was like everyone back then thought the internet was going to change the world.
And in many ways it did, right?
Oh, absolutely. But in this story, their groundbreaking work is being sabotaged, ripped apart from the inside. And the guy tasked with untangling this mess is Detective Alex Yang, a self-proclaimed dinosaur in a land of digital natives. Can you even imagine? It's like dropping Sherlock Holmes into a server room.
Huh. I love that analogy. Talk about a culture clash. You've got this seasoned investigator, probably used to dealing with physical evidence and face-to-face interrogations.
Exactly. But suddenly he's surrounded by geeks with their frantic coding and stained pizza boxes, as he calls them, and I can totally feel his disorientation. The excerpt describes him feeling that familiar dread settling in, like when you realize you're way out your depth.
I can only imagine. The language, the technology, even the culture of this startup world, it's completely alien to him. It really makes you think about how traditional detective work needs to adapt to keep up with the changing times, especially in a world that's becoming increasingly digital. I mean, even back then, the stakes were so high.
Oh, for sure. We're not talking about some petty theft here. NetQuest is on the brink of something huge, something revolutionary, and that kind of potential attracts not just investors, but also those who stand to lose big time if they succeed.
Right, exactly. And that's where that idea of sabotage comes in. This source mentions something along the lines of sabotage was the kind of solution old money understood, which kind of hints at those established powers feeling threatened by this, like, upstart digital company. Makes you wonder, does innovation inherently create its own enemies, its own forms of crime?
That's a great point. It's like throughout history, you see these patterns of those in power trying to either suppress or, co-opt anything that might disrupt the status quo. But in this case, how do you even begin to investigate digital sabotage? We're not talking about fingerprints or a broken window, right?
Well, right, and that's where the expertise comes in. The story points out how the initial assumption, like, oh, it's just a glitch, is immediately dismissed. They realize the problem is too clean, too intentional. It wasn't some random virus, but like a scalpel, they said.
A scalpel. Wow, that's such a powerful image. And
Yeah.
it's so telling, right?
Absolutely. It suggests precision, a targeted attack by someone who knew exactly where to strike to do the most damage, someone with intimate knowledge of NetQuest systems.
Makes you think of a surgeon, right? Instead of like a blunt instrument.
Precisely. And that kind of expertise really narrows down the suspect pool, doesn't it? It points towards an insider or someone with very specific technical skills.
And that leads them to Lisa, the hacker, who is like dragged kicking and screaming from her cyberpunk den. I love that description. You've got this old school detective and this like counterculture tech whiz forced to work together.
It's such a great contrast, right? And it highlights this idea that expertise can come from the most unexpected places. You don't always find the answers in the mainstream. Sometimes you've got to look to the fringes, to those who operate outside the system.
Lisa's one of those characters who seems really dismissive at first, especially of the coders at NetQuest. But then when she sees the attack, her whole demeanor changes. She sees the sophistication, the nested loops, and it's almost like she recognizes a twisted kind of artistry in it.
Right. She's like, whoa, whoever did this knows their stuff. It suggests that even in the world of cybercrime, there's a certain, albeit kind of perverse level of mastery.
And the fact that she can immediately spot that skill, even though she's not part of the company, tells you a lot, right? Like how tight-knit that world might be, or even how dangerous someone with those abilities could be.
Absolutely. It reinforces the idea that the talent to create can also be used to destroy.
So where does the investigation go from there?
Well, naturally, they start looking at the usual suspects.
Yeah.
And the first one that pops up is this rival startup whose browser development seems to be suspiciously ahead of schedule. Classic case of corporate espionage, right?
Totally. You can almost picture these like old school execs in a panic as a bunch of kids in hoodies threaten to steal their empire.
It's a familiar story, right?
Yeah.
David versus Goliath, but
Mhm.
with code instead of slingshots.
Yeah.
But, as the text points out, proving digital theft is anything but easy. How do you catch someone red-handed when what they're stealing is basically intangible?
It's like, what's the equivalent of fingerprints in the digital world?
Exactly. So what do? They get creative. They come up with this ingenious plan, a staged sting operation. They leak this fake news story about a big breakthrough at NetQuest, and they seed it with code that's deliberately vulnerable. It's like setting a digital trap.
That's so clever. It reminds me of like those classic heist movies where they leave a fake diamond out in the open knowing the thief will go for it.
Exactly. And it highlights this shift in investigative tactics,
Right.
right? You can't always rely on physical evidence in the digital realm, so you have to think outside the box, create scenarios that will force the perpetrator to expose themselves.
And it seems to work because, bam, the rival startup takes the bait, Lisa's all got him, and everything seems wrapped up in a neat little bow. Corporate espionage, case closed.
Except it's not that simple, is it?
Nope. Here comes the twist. The CEO of the rival company, he's not celebrating. He's genuinely confused. It turns out the code they stole, it wasn't really stolen at all. They found it online, just floating out there in cyberspace, posted anonymously.
Wow. Talk about a plot twist.
Yeah.
So it wasn't external competition, but internal sabotage after all.
Yeah.
And even more than that, it was framed to look like it was the rival company.
Yeah, someone within NetQuest was playing a very dangerous game, and this completely flips the investigation on its head, right? Suddenly, the threat isn't some outside force, it's coming from within. Betrayal lurking in the shadows of innovation.
Exactly. And that forces Detective Yang to shift his focus. He's no longer looking at rival companies. He's looking at the team profiles, the overlooked and the underappreciated, as the source puts it. It's like he suddenly realized he's been looking in the wrong direction the whole time.
And guess who emerges as the prime suspect? A disgruntled ex-employee. A genius coder, fired just weeks ago. Someone with both the skills and the motive to tear down the very company he helped build.
Classic inside job, right? But with a very modern weapon. Code.
And the way he's described in his apartment, it's almost tragic. It's like a shrine to obsolete tech, the source says. A symphony of beeping modems and flickering CRT monitors. It's as if he's retreated to a past where he felt valued, using his outdated knowledge to lash out at the future that's left him behind.
It's a poignant detail, isn't it? And his confession really drives that point home. They stole my work, he says, so I stole their future. You can practically hear the bitterness, the sense of injustice that fueled his actions.
It's a reminder that even in this world of cutting-edge technology, the human element can't be ignored. The things that drive us, our emotions, our desires, our resentments, they all find a way to manifest, even in the digital world.
Absolutely. And as Detective Yang reflects on the case, he realizes that the internet, for all its promises of a utopian future, still has this dark, lawless underbelly. It's like a Wild West, he says, with invisible weapons and ruthless ambition.
And what about Lisa? Does she stay and help clean up the mess she helped uncover?
Nope, she chooses to remain outside the system. Which is like a perfect encapsulation of this whole idea that while technology might evolve, human nature, for better or for worse, seems to stay pretty constant.
Okay, so I think we've spent enough time in the digital world for now, ready for something completely different.
Lead the way.
All right, let's step into the shadows now, into a world where the rules are, shall we say, a bit more fluid. We're talking about Blood Oath. And here, our detective is Elias Thorne, a centuries-old vampire. But not just any vampire. He's bound by a blood oath to only prey on the guilty.
Okay, that's a twist I wasn't expecting. It's like taking the classic vampire myth and turning it on its head. Suddenly you have this predator who's also an instrument of justice, a creature of darkness walking a very fine line.
Right, and he's facing a crisis that threatens to shatter the already fragile peace between vampires and humans, a series of vampire murders, which, as you might imagine, is a pretty big deal in their world.
Yeah, I mean, if vampires are killing each other, that kind of throws a wrench in the whole masquerade thing, right? Like,
Right.
how do you keep your existence secret when bodies start piling up?
And these aren't just any murders. The first victim we encounter isn't just killed, they're desecrated, which really emphasizes the violation, even for someone like Elias who's been around for centuries. The excerpt says he felt his own blood boil at the sight.
It speaks to the gravity of the situation, right? It's not just a crime, it's a sacrilege, a violation of their ancient laws and traditions. And to make things even more complicated, the human police, they know about Elias. They even tolerate him, but it's a very uneasy alliance. They need his old world knowledge, but they keep him on a carefully concealed leash, as the source puts it.
It's like this unspoken agreement. You help us deal with your kind, and we'll look the other way. It really highlights the precarious balance of power between these two worlds, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's a reminder that sometimes even sworn enemies have to work together when faced with a common threat. But trust is a luxury neither side can afford.
And for Elias, this case gets personal very quickly. The killer is deliberately recreating ancient rituals, a bait designed to draw him in. And not just him, but every vampire who'd sworn off human prey, as the text explains. It's a direct challenge to everything Elias stands for.
It's a provocation, isn't it? Like, the killer is intentionally poking the bear, trying to stir up trouble. And those ancient rituals, they likely symbolize a return to a more primal, less civilized form of vampirism, maybe even a longing for the days before the truce with humanity.
And surprisingly, the trail leads Elias to, wait for it, a synthetic blood company called Hematech. I mean, talk about a juxtaposition. Ancient rituals and a modern corporation. What's the connection there?
It immediately sets up this conflict between the old and the new, doesn't it? You've got those who cling to tradition, to the old ways, and those who are embracing or even trying to replace them. And Hematech, with their synthetic blood, they represent a solution to the age-old problem of vampire feeding, a way to coexist with humans without, well, preying on them. So it makes you wonder, is someone trying to disrupt that piece? Maybe they see synthetic blood as a threat to their way of life, or maybe there's a more personal motive at play.
Right. And when Elias meets the CEO of Hematech, this guy is described as sleek and arrogant, oozing modern wealth. But Elias senses something more, something darker. He even describes the intoxicating taste of the real thing.
Oh, interesting. So the CEO might be putting on a good show, but Elias, with his heightened senses, picks up on something that doesn't quite add up. And sure enough, they find a clue. A smear of true blood under the victim's nails. It's like finding a fingerprint at a crime scene. It completely blows the CEO's cover, doesn't it? Here's this guy profiting from the alternative to human blood while secretly indulging in it himself.
Total hypocrisy. And it gives Elias a possible motive. Maybe the CEO is trying to sabotage the truce, or maybe he's eliminating anyone who might expose his little secret.
It's a classic power play, right? Maintain control by any means necessary.
And the confrontation between them, it's like a clash of titans. You've got Elias, this ancient predator, in a sterile, modern boardroom. The CEO tries to dismiss Elias as a relic of the past, but he underestimates Elias's power. And things escalate pretty quickly.
I bet. What happens? Does Elias lose control?
Oh, he definitely lets loose. The source describes him unleashing his predator's gift. But even as he's delivering justice, you can sense this inner turmoil. The hunger gnawed at him, the text says. There's a sense of guilt, of regret.
Right. It highlights that constant struggle within him, doesn't it? The tension between his desire to do good, to uphold justice, and his inherent nature as a predator. Even when he's acting righteously, there's a part of him that relishes the violence. It adds this really fascinating layer of complexity to his character.
Absolutely. And then he does something really bold. He dumps the CEO's body right on the doorstep of the Vampire Council. Like, hey, look what's going on under your watch.
Wow, that's a statement. He's
Yeah.
basically calling them out, saying, your traditions are failing and you're not doing enough to protect your own kind.
And Elias, he knows the killer is one of them, someone hiding in plain sight. So now he's hunting a predator within a den of predators. Talk about a high-stakes game.
Right. And it forces him to turn his investigative skills inward toward his own community. It makes you wonder, what are the challenges of investigating within a group that's built on secrecy and power? How do you find the truth when everyone has something to hide?
It's gotta be tough, right? You're constantly questioning who you can trust. Everyone's a suspect. And as he gets closer to the truth, he realizes the corruption runs deeper than he imagined, all the way to the top.
Oh man, that's scary. So what does he do?
He confronts the council leader, and there's this moment where he catches a whiff of forbidden prey, confirming his suspicions, and then he does something really graphic. He threatens the leader, saying, "You first, or I take down your whole corrupt house." It's a gamble. He's willing to break his own code to become the very thing he's fighting against in order to expose the truth.
That's a powerful moment. He's essentially saying that sometimes the ends justify the means. And it works, right? The council backs down.
They do, but out of fear, not respect. It's a temporary victory, a reprieve, as the text calls it. Elias knows the fight's far from over. There's this lingering sense of unease that the system itself is flawed. He even describes the blood oath as feeling like a noose around his neck.
It's a reminder that even well-intentioned rules can become a burden, especially when those in power abuse them. Sometimes you have to be willing to break the mold to achieve true justice.
So we've got these two very different investigations, one in the bright, chaotic world of Silicon Valley and the other in the shadowy, ancient realm of vampires. What are your takeaways from these stories?
Well, first of all, I think it's fascinating how both cases showcase the evolving nature of crime, right? In Ghost Code, we see how technological advancement doesn't eliminate crime, it just changes its form. And the digital world, with its anonymity and complexity, creates a whole new set of challenges for investigators.
Yeah, and the idea that the culprit in Ghost Code is a disgruntled insider, that's such a modern problem, isn't it? The potential for betrayal, for someone to use their knowledge against the very system that created them. It's a reminder that even in the most innovative environments, human nature, with all its flaws and complexities, is still the driving force behind a lot of crimes. And what about Blood Oath? What stood out to you about that one?
For me, Blood Oath really emphasizes the idea that order, even in a society with ancient rules and traditions, is incredibly fragile. The greatest threat often comes from within, from those who abuse their power or cling to outdated ways of thinking. And it makes you consider the compromises that are sometimes necessary to maintain peace, and the personal toll it takes on those who are tasked with upholding justice, especially when they're fighting against their own nature.
It's like those classic noir films, right? Where the detective is often as flawed as the criminals they're chasing.
Exactly. And that moral ambiguity, I think that's what makes these stories so compelling. They force us to look beyond the surface and wrestle with these really tough questions about right and wrong, about the nature of justice, and about how to navigate a world that's constantly changing. And they make you wonder, what other unexpected arenas out there might hold their own unique forms of crime and investigation?
Yeah, that's a great question. It makes you realize there are so many stories out there waiting to be uncovered. But that's all the time we have for today, folks, so keep those questions simmering. And be sure to join us next time on the True Detectives podcast for another wild investigation into the stranger side of crime and detection.
And don't forget to rate and follow the show so you don't miss out on any more crazy, weird, and unbelievable true crime stories.
Until next time, stay curious.